there. Welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Monday, the 24th. And I hope you had a very nice spring break. And where we are is putting some closure onto Much Ado About Nothing, talking a little bit about paper number one, which I had indicated that would be due on Wednesday, and ultimately getting ready for a transition into our history plays. So, in terms of Much Ado About Nothing, just a couple of points I wanted to make. The idea of the word nothing, and Shakespeare, of course, is brilliant in using multiple meanings. You can see in the notes below in the first section that nothing would be something that's trivial. There was much ado about something that really wasn't real. So, that's one level of meaning. But nothing is very close to noting, and this is very much a play about seeing and noting. But nothing was also a term used for female genitalia. And of course, we know the importance of female virginity, especially in this play, and one we will be seeing or reading, or both, as we enter into the tragedy section, Othello, which is very similar to Much Ado About Nothing, but it is a tragic play. A couple of observations that I wanted to make about quotations, and this play has wonderful quotations. It's perhaps one of Shakespeare's wittiest plays, and we had talked a little bit about how it's in prose because it is a play that is very much set in reality as opposed to what we were reading with Much Ado About, or I'm sorry, with Midsummer Night's Dream, which was very much in a fantasy magical world. In Act 1, Scene 1, line 63, Leonardo is speaking and talking about a skirmish of wit between Benedict and Beatrice. I believe I had indicated this last class that the men are coming back from war. This sets the stage for them entering into a new battle. But in terms of Benedict, Beatrice is a worthy opponent as they battle with words, using words as weapons. And I suspect that many times Beatrice has the upper hand. After all, she's able to convince Benedict to kill. Now, that said, we know that in a comedy we can't have murder and we can't have death. So, of course, that doesn't come to fruition. But it's something that he's willing to do to prove his love for Beatrice, which goes to show the amount of power that she has over him, even though she laments the fact that she doesn't have power as female. Oh, if I were a man. And it strikes me as such an important speech because, yes, part of it is indeed true that she doesn't have the power and the voice and the capabilities of a male in this very patriarchal society. But it also reminds me of Lady Macbeth, a play that we'll be getting to when we get to the tragedy section, where she ultimately convinces Macbeth to kill for her. And of course, since it's a tragedy, he does so, and he does so for his own benefit as well. But the reality is that she never dirties her hands. And in some ways, we could say that she is a master manipulator. And perhaps in some ways, so is Beatrice. Nevertheless, Act 1, Scene 1, line 160, I think clearly illustrates the difference between the relationship between Claudio and Hero, and that's supposed to be our primary relationship, as opposed to Benedict and Beatrice. And even though that's supposed to be the secondary relationship, that's really the interesting relationship. So when we saw the version that was done by Kenneth Branagh of Much Ado About Nothing, he gave himself the role of Benedict, him being director as well, and he gave his wife, or his wife at the time, the role of Beatrice, because those really are the lead roles in this play. But in Act 1, Scene 1, line 160, we see how insecure Benedict is. And he says ultimately that, he's looking for approval. And we see how he's looking for approval in Act 1, Scene 1, line 160, when it's of such importance to him that Benedict support his position that he should be pursuing Hero. And one of the things that Benedict says, or I should say that Claudio says, is, Benedict, dost thou note the daughter of Signor Leonardo? And Benedict says, I noted her not, but I looked on her. Can't remember, think about all of the differences of meaning of note. And Claudio says, is she not a modest young lady? And Benedict says, do you question me as an honest man should do for my simple true judgment? Or would you have me speak after my custom as being a professed tyrant to their sex? And Claudio says, no, I pray thee, speak in sober judgment. Think about how Borraccio is drunk and how you can become drunk when you're in love. So the idea of sobriety and drunkenness is embedded within the play. And Benedict says, why in faith methinks she's too low for a high praise, too brown for a fair praise, too little for a great praise. Only this commendation I can afford her, that were she other than she is, she were unhandsome. And being no other but as she is, I do not like her. And of course, we have to get through all of that convoluted language to basically see that Benedict does indeed praise her. And Benedict says, would you buy her that you could inquire after her? Or Benedict asks, would you buy her that you could inquire after her? And Claudio says, can the world buy such a jewel? And Benedict says, yay, and put a case into it too. And I was so glad that they left that piece of dialogue. Obviously, they had to do some cuts with the Hollywood version that we saw. But we know that that Claudio is quite insecure. We know that Claudio is looking for Benedict's approval. We know that Claudio is easily manipulated early on in the play to assume that Hero is not necessarily going to be faithful to him. And we know that this occurs a second time in the play, all because of Don John and his evil machinations. Now, in Act 2, Scene 1, line 72, we get reference to the idea of the reality of love. And we know that while Shakespeare celebrates love, he's also critical of love. One might say perhaps he's a realist when he talks a little bit about some of the negatives associated with love. And Beatrice says, for hear me, Hero, wooing, wedding, and repenting is as a Scotch jig, a measure, and a sing pace. The first suit is hot and hasty, like a Scotch jig, and full is fantastical. The wedding, mannerly modest a measure, full of state and ancientry. And then comes repentance, and with his bad legs falls into the sink pace faster and faster, till he sink into his grave. The reality of love and the reality of wooing, that ultimately it begins with great passion, and then there's the formalities of marriage, and then afterwards there is regret. Though, of course, we know that with the comedy, we can't assume that there will be regret for these couples at the ending of the play. We assume a happy ending. And then, of course, Act 4, Scene 3, line 303, when Beatrice is saying, and this is such a fascinating play in terms of analyzing gender relationships, which is something that you can do with Midsummer as well. Oh, if I were a man speech, where I've argued that in some ways it's her ability to persuade Benedict to take action for her that shows her superiority in relationship. Act 4, Scene 3, line 303 or so. And let me just find that here. Why do I not find it? Act 4, Scene 3, line 303. I wish I had better light in this room. I don't see it right now in front of me, but I'm sure that... Oh, here it is. Is it not approved in the height of a villain that hath slandered, scorned, dishonored my woman? Oh, that I were a man! What? Bear her a hand until they come to take hands, and then with public accusation, uncovered slander, unmitigated rancor? Oh God, that I were a man! I would eat his heart in the marketplace. So, as we see, And that's actually in Act 4, Scene 1. That's probably why I couldn't find it, line 303. So the happy ending, which of course comes with the question mark. The couples are together, though from modern day sensibilities, we wonder why Hero would so easily forgive Claudio. Claudio is not killed, though, again, from modern day sensibilities, there seems to be some sort of injustice with Claudio not having to accept the responsibility for his actions. Hero's honor is restored, or at least her reputation is restored. Her honor's never been under attack. And of course, for modern day sensibilities, this too seems quite unjust. And Don John will be punished later. And the assumption that evil will be punished, but that it's not appropriate to do so at the ending of a play. So, in terms of getting ready for paper number 1, my suspicion is that you would be writing about A Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing. As you know, the sonnets are also a possibility, but writing about a sonnet is a very different kind of exercise than writing on a full play. And I had given you the suggestion to talk about all of the complexities within Shakespeare's plays, one of the quotes that I had included in the syllabus. Though certainly you can write on your own topic, you just need to get that topic approved by me. And hopefully, if you haven't already submitted it in, thank you for those of you who have, you will submit it in by Wednesday, or certainly keep me updated as to the status of your paper. You'll send that via PDF to my email, which is how my grading program works best. My email is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. So the history plays are notoriously complex, and we think that the history plays were written mostly after the comedies. We think the comedies were mostly written during the first part of Shakespeare's career. And they are very loosely based on English history. So, in order to be considered a history play, it has to be about England, it has to be about Britain. And that means Julius Caesar could not be considered to be a history play. And also, there was a history book at the time that was considered to be the definitive text, the Chronicles of Holinshed. But Shakespeare took all kinds of liberties, so while it might be useful knowing the history of the time, it can also be somewhat frustrating when you expect certain things to occur. Shakespeare would have changed those events for dramatic purposes. And the idea of chronicle plays, that you've got one play that tells a story that goes into another play, that goes into another play. You can read all of them individually, but if you read them as a whole, it tells a larger piece of history. It was an opportunity for British citizenry to celebrate their patriotism as they relive some of the historical elements of their past. It was also a wonderful opportunity for Shakespeare to make political commentary. And if you'll remember, there was a censor at the time, the Master of Revels, if you will, who basically was watching quite carefully about political commentary. There was much more latitude with sexual innuendo, there was much more latitude with violence, but political commentary could get you into trouble with the queen or with the ruler and place. And we'll talk a little bit about the transition from Queen Elizabeth to King James, which occurred during Shakespeare's time when we talk about Macbeth. But this political commentary, I think, was done cleverly by Shakespeare, because you could always claim innocence and say that just because there happen to be similarities with contemporary political times, that doesn't necessarily mean that he was making some sort of statement about contemporary political times, because he was just reviewing the history of the past. So that provided him a wonderful opportunity to talk about some of the major elements that were under question at the time, particularly with Queen Elizabeth, who was getting older and nearing the ending of her realm without any direct heirs, known as the Virgin Queen, because she never had direct heirs. So the question of who would succeed Elizabeth was on everybody's minds, but again, it wasn't something that you talked about in public forums. And what exactly makes a good leader? Is it birthright, or is it ability? Or is it some combination of the two, perhaps? But that was the question, because birthright was not so easily determined because Queen Elizabeth did not have a direct heir. And this is a question that is central in Richard II. Richard II, who is the ruler at the beginning of the play, he has birthright, but he doesn't have ability. Bolingbroke, who is further removed in the royal family, but still a royal, ultimately will be taking over power. Spoiler alert here. And he seems to have greater ability, or it could just be that he's more clever, which is what we'll talk about when we talk about Richard II. Expect lots of darkness, expect lots of death, expect lots of interior action so that you can get a sense of claustrophobia. As I said, part of the reasons why the history plays are considered so complex is because there are so many characters. So you might want to keep a chart, but more importantly, focus on the main characters. And if you have difficulty understanding the dynamics of a history play, I suggest that you might want to think about Washington, D.C., and perhaps even substitute some of the names from our Washington, D.C. political world into Richard II. And then all of a sudden things might make a whole lot of sense to you. And I've been teaching this play for a very long time, so I've seen lots of different administrations come and go in Washington, D.C. And every single year, it seems like there are parallels with what's happening in Washington. So expect a lot of political intrigue. Expect a lot of shifting alliances. Expect not to necessarily know the truth. At the time, the king would be considered God anointed, and one didn't question the king's actions because he was basically seen second in the chain of being, that hierarchy that existed in the Renaissance. And he would be seen as the highest being on earth, the God anointed. So questioning the king would be comparable to questioning God himself. And Richard II, the history of Richard II, this was a medieval king in England who was a boy king, because ultimately it was all about succession. And the adults around him, his family members, and also part of the royal political environment, they basically ruled until Richard was of age. And that meant that Richard never really learned how to become an independent ruler. And the consequences were, and again, this is the actual history, is that we had a very poor ruler in Richard who was ultimately overthrown by Bolingbroke. But if you are reading some of the accounts of Richard II, you will see that historically it's uncertain whether he was overthrown by Bolingbroke or if he was overthrown by Gloucester. And for the purposes of this play, we will see that he is overthrown by Bolingbroke. This play has perhaps some of Shakespeare's most famous speeches. They can be quite long, but also quite beautiful as well. And when we get to the point of watching performance, the performance I wanted us to see is from the BBC. The BBC had quite the experiment in the 1980s where they put all of Shakespeare's plays in video form in the most accurate way possible. So the BBC, a very well-renowned media company in Britain, and all of Shakespeare's plays can be found through BBC Productions, but these are the closest you're going to get to Shakespeare's actual language. So if you are struggling with the play and understanding what's happening, I definitely recommend watching a BBC version. And because the histories are notoriously complex, I wanted us to see a BBC version because you can basically just read along almost word for word. And the GCC library luckily has access to the BBC library of plays, so I can provide you with that link. And going back to paper number 1, I just wanted to briefly talk about quotation because, as you know, your job is to provide enough quotation, direct language from the plays, and also paraphrase some of the explanations of action in the play, but using your language, not necessarily quoting. And that is your evidence. And I basically am looking for the evidence that you're providing so that your position is possible, not even probable. So you're much in the position of, let's say, an attorney who's trying to put together arguments. And you can see that in the 5th section, the notes below, I've given you some examples of quotation. Now that you are going to have to quote for Shakespeare for your first paper. And if you're just quoting a word or two, you can do so and you don't need to document, which is the first example that you're given. Hamlet speaks of himself as, quote, dull and muddy-headed rascal, unquote, quote, coward, unquote, quote, villain, unquote, and a, quote, ass, unquote. So if you are going to be quoting, though, a phrase, then you want to make sure that you are documenting. And because Shakespearean plays are divided into act, scene, and line, the documentation is much easier than it would be if you were quoting from another source. So you can reference the plays, much like I've been referencing the plays in class, by act, scene, and line. So an example in the 5th section below, Hamlet imagines the world as, quote, an unweeded garden / that grows to seed, unquote. And then immediately afterwards, doesn't matter if your sentence is done or not, you use parentheses, and within those parentheses you indicate the act, which is a capital Roman numeral with a period afterwards, the scene, which is a lowercase Roman numeral with a period afterwards, and then the line number or numbers, which are Arabic numbers. And you can see that the quote that I've just given you is from Act 1, Scene 2, line 135-136. You don't need to write the word page or PG or anything like that in the parentheses. You want to try to keep it as simple and clean as possible. And that / indicates that there's a break in line in poetry. So if you are quoting from Shakespeare and it happens to be a piece of poetry, if it's a shorter piece of poetry, so that would be 3 lines or fewer, then you can incorporate that into the body of your text. And the way you would show the ending of one line and the beginning of the next is with the / And if you continue looking with some of the examples I've given you, I've also given you examples. If you were to quote a piece of poetry that's longer than 3 lines, you can just quote the poem in the way that it would appear with its normal line breaks. So Hamlet begins his first soliloquy with his wish for self-destruction. So what we've got here is a block quote, is what it's known. You're blocking it off. Oh, that this too sallied flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon against self-slaughter. Notice no quotation marks are used because when you're using a block quote, you're already indicating to the reader that you are quoting. So you don't need to use quotation marks. That would be considered redundant. In this instance, the punctuation goes first, then the parenthetical documentation. I'm honestly not sure why, but that's just the convention that we follow. So we see after the ending punctuation, we've got in parentheses, Act 1, Scene 2, line 129 through 32. And if you are leaving out a line of text, which is the next example, Hamlet reflects upon the temptation to destroy himself as when he wonders, who would bear the whips and scorns of time? And notice that we've got a bunch of periods after that. That means an entire line has been deleted or more. when he himself might his quietest make with a bare bodkin. And you can see the documentation there. Act 3, Scene 1, line 69, comma, and then that long line of periods, the long ellipsis, which show that there's a break between line 69 to where you've picked up again with line 74 through 5. And the ellipsis is usually 3 periods. And if you ever seen ellipsis inside of a quote, that's meaning that you've left out a word or several words. Not to change the meaning of the quote, because that would be unethical, but something that just would not be relevant. And you can see that if you are looking for an ellipsis with just leaving out a few words, I've got an example here where I'm quoting from prose. So prose, again, is when one line goes from one end of the margin to the other. So I would not need to in any way use a slash to indicate a break in a line of poetry, because this is not poetry. And because it's short, I don't need to block it off. I can incorporate it within the body of my text. And the example is, world weariness overtakes Hamlet in his remarks to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Quote, I have of late, and then you can see the ellipsis, dot, 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 or period, period, period. But wherefore I know not, here's another ellipsis, lost my mirth, forgotten all custom of exercises. And indeed, it goes so heavily with my disposition that this goodly frame, the earth, seems to me a sterile promontory. And of course, we've got a closing quote. We've got our documentation. Act 2, Scene 2, line 295 through 99, close parentheses, and then ending punctuation. Generally speaking, you only need to use an ellipsis when you're omitting something from the middle of a passage. The assumption is that text came before you decided to begin quoting. And the assumption is that text came after you decided to stop quoting, so you wouldn't need to use an ellipsis at the beginning or the end. And I think we had talked about this also at the very beginning of the semester, that if you use square brackets inside of a quote, that means that you are inserting your own language. It's something that you sometimes see when you're reading a Shakespearean play, where a piece of dialogue will be in a square bracket, and that's the editor's insertion, their best guess, because as we discussed, there are some questions about specifically what Shakespeare might have written in his plays, because there's so many versions, the quartos and the folios. If you were to use square brackets when you are quoting, then what you are doing is inserting your own language into that quote, usually to clarify something. Certainly not to comment on the relevance of the quote. That would be something that you could do immediately beforehand or immediately afterwards. But if you wanted to make a commentary in the middle of the quote because it's necessary to clarify a piece of information, it's almost like interrupting somebody when they're speaking. You don't want to do it unless it's absolutely necessary. Then the piece of information that you needed to clarify, you could clarify it within square brackets after that word that needs clarification. It oftentimes happens with the use of pronouns, she or he or they, where the quote you've selected, it's unclear which character you're discussing. So within the square brackets, after the she or the he or the they, you could give a name, such as Claudio, for instance, after the word he. So it's clear that we're discussing Claudio rather than discussing one of the other characters in Much Ado About Nothing. So those were just a few points as you are working on your paper. And our attendance question today, which will be due on Wednesday, the 26th. Again, you're not required to respond to your peers, so certainly encouraged to, but you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. Is which comedy, A Midsummer Night's Dream or A Much Ado About Nothing, did you prefer and why? And as usual, my attendance questions don't necessarily have right or wrong answers. I'm more interested in your reasoning than I am in the actual answer itself. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class with Richard II. Take care. Bye-bye.